In Demon Souls, the Archstones were simply a point where you can warp to the hub, but in Dark Souls, they were made into a checkpoint where you can do a few more things, including level up. The only difference between Graces and Bonfires is that you can't warp from bonfires at the start, but the feature would be unlocked later. This one should be obvious for Dark Souls fans, but the Archery and Putrid avatars reuse the general skeleton and a good chunk of the moveset of the Silent Demon in particular. Of course, they do still have additional attacks or expansions of them, and it's reused just as proportionately. Another near 1-to-1 mechanic that was reused was the Crimson Flask. The Estus Flask being a limited consumable that is recharged at the bonfire. The only thing different from Dark Souls 1 in particular is how you got more. Later in Dark Souls 3 you would collect an item to increase it, just like Golden Seeds in Elden Ring. In Demon Souls, the mindless flailing undead enemies were limited to one area, really. It wasn't until Dark Souls that they became a reoccurring staple, with multiple variants on the enemy in the same game alone. With that said, I won't mention all the reused concept of enemies, unless they feel interesting enough. For instance, Knight enemies. Those obviously have similar classes in all the games, but they're also, knights. The bleeding status effect did exist in Demon Souls, but it worked more like a lesser effect of poison, which makes sense, but to distinguish it more, bleed in Dark Souls was made to cause a percentage of health damage when procced, and it's remained mostly the same until Elden Ring's hemorrhaging. This is the first of many enemies that are a near identical copy from any of the Dark Souls games into Elden Ring. Be it a model that's been reused, or moveset, or likely both, there will be many more coming up. Here's a few more that I don't have much to comment on, and are nearly taken 1-to-1. This is a common comparison you see discussed online. Black Knights are a non-responding mini-boss type enemy that are spread out throughout the game, which are formerly affiliated with the leaders of the era. The main difference is that no Black Knight ever has had the true boss status with the big health bar. But if Dark Souls was as big a game as Elden Ring, perhaps some could be. The Scarabs are 100% this game's version of the Crystal Lizards, just sometimes dropping things other than upgrade material and the like. Demon Souls also had the lizards, but they had limited spawns and respawns if you scare them off, being more punishing. The vertical slice down attack with a following ground effect has become a staple of special weapon attacks in the series, and they started in Dark Souls, with the Drake Sword and the Dragon Greatsword. Alexander has a pretty identical character archetype to Siegmeyer, and later Siegward in Dark Souls 3, both being, well, not the brightest characters, and often needing assistance from players to proceed in their questline. Similar to the Archery avatar, the Omen Killers share a bit with the Capra Demon, though perhaps not as much as a prior example. We already showed the Basilisk briefly, but I'd be remiss not to discuss how Deathblight is almost the same status effect as Curse. In Dark Souls 1, if you got cursed, you did have your health cut in half until it was cured, but this was dropped in Dark Souls 2 as Purification, in 3 where it was called Curse again, and then works the same as Deathblight. There were invader type NPCs in Demon Souls, but they were usually already spawned into the levels, where Dark Souls introduced them more in the style of the online play invasion system. This one is a more loose connection, but the Omen are a similar type of enemy to some of the bigger enemies in Dark Souls, such as the Infested Barbarians in Dark Souls 1, or maybe even more closely to the Harald Legion in Dark Souls 3 DLC, Ring City. An excessively long katana has more or less become a staple in these games, starting with the Washing Pole in Dark Souls, and is currently incarnated into the Nagikiba, which do have some historical precedence. Unfortunately, there's currently no Chaos Blade variant in Elden Ring, which dates back to even Demon Souls, hopefully in the DLC. This one is different enough that I don't think it's a complete reuse of a concept. Obviously the Red Wolf uses more magic than anything, but using a big sword in its mouth as a weapon is rather suspect. The main thing that sold me on these two is how both of them are used as slaves. The trolls to carry around the giant vault carriage things, and the giants for a handful of tasks, like opening Sen's Fortress and the boulder traps. Hope this one goes without saying, they just use fire instead of lightning on occasion. Another staple of the games tends to be having one singular giant hat, either worn by a character, boss, or just an armor piece. And Sylvanas' hat definitely fits the bill. He's even presumably a sorcerer, just like Big Head Logan. Demon Souls had some giant swords, but starting with this one's great sword, this general design was brought back over and over. Berserk, The guardian golems do remind me a fair bit of the Iron Golem, but obviously the giant automaton idea wasn't created by FromSoft. Both of these castles are the seat of the current rulers of the land, and is a big turning point in their respective games' goals. You can even link back to how both of these rulers had a war with dragons to establish a new era. I almost forgot about this one, but yeah, the giant blacksmith is another reused idea. This one is not one I realized at first, but both of these have very similarly shaped armor, and both carry a giant hammer. They even share a few moves, including that weapons Asher wore. Another common comparison in the community, the Godskin duo borrows elements from both Ornstein and Smo, and from the Four Kings. The former by the design of the bosses being somewhat of a visual parallel, and ideally fought similarly by splitting them up with the pillars in the arena. And the latter mostly by the respawning nature of the boss, even having the thing where you can keep hitting the corpse of a fallen one to keep doing damage to the total health bar, though that's probably just because they are programmed similarly, rather than intentional. Speaking of the Four Kings, the void of an area that was used in the Omen Twin boss room is identical to the Four Kings. They even had a potential mechanic similarity, as the Morgoth corresponding Omen hangs back a lot more and approaches you more slowly. When in the Four Kings, it does seem that occasionally the latter Four Kings will try to hang back a little bit, though it doesn't always work out that way. They'll become more common later on, but that dark hand grab attack concept is definitely reused for other things, in this case for the lifesteal fist most prominently, though dark hand steals humanity instead of life. Obviously the Moonlight Greatsword has been around even before Demon Souls, but the modern incarnation of it being able to shoot projectiles the way it does started with Dark Souls. In Demon Souls it couldn't, instead it goes through shields, which is still really strong in its own way. The design of both of these are different, but they both have the unique feature of doing damage when you roll into something, albeit pretty small. The Necromancers in the Catacombs of Dark Souls 1 that can revive skeletons indefinitely are used identically in Elden Ring, with a reviving commoner in like one dungeon, though the idea is kinda similar with the Spirit Caller snails, except for the variety of enemies. The Mask of the Father in particular reminds me a lot of the Glintstone Crowns, so it does feel like a possible inspiration for them. For the last time, do I need to explain? This was also originally in Demon Souls, but it was a lot slower. This incarnation of it is identical to the Wrath of Gold, if the name didn't make it obvious. Perhaps it's a crow motif, but to me the crow demons, and I suppose the Corvians in Dark Souls 3, do give me a lot of symbolism of death. And well, the Deathbirds are a lot more on the nose about that. The deep-root depths do remind me a lot of Ashlyk in particular, but I can't really put my finger on why. The ancient dragons in Elden Ring have a similar kind of design and concept as the stone dragons, in that they're both everlasting dragons that are made of apparently stone in some ways, and both prior rulers of the land, as mentioned earlier. Placidusax in particular reminds me of the singular dragon you find in Ashlyk, both being passive, or at least at first for Placidusax, which can also be reflected with the ancient dragon in Dark Souls 2. Though it's really just a lion that has a weapon attached, the aggressiveness of the enemy do remind you a lot of the Sanctuary Guardian. The agility of both of these, along with the wolf motif, definitely remind me of each other, but could be a bit of a stretch. The Lion's Claw is one of the few one-to-one Ashes of War that is taken from a game besides Dark Souls 3. I mean, it is in Dark Souls 3 as well, as weapon art, and boy there's a lot of those, but the animation started here. Artorias does this attack too, of course. Starting in Dark Souls, you could either farm or find enemy heads and put them on as helmets, which I certainly would love to do later on. Black Flame as a class of spells will be expanded on later on, but the first version of it is the singular Black Flame attack from Dark Souls 1 DLC.
Hello.
The area of effect attacks became way more common later on, but I believe this is the first one of its kind, in the Obsidian Greatsword. Even the animation is iconic. These two areas serve a very similar purpose, especially if you take into account the part where you burn yourself in their corresponding paths, or endings. And I mean, yeah, for at least this segment of Elden Ring, there's a big emphasis on the theme of burning or fire, which is seen throughout the entire Dark Souls series. The similarity between these two is mostly in the lore end, being lords of an era that desperately try to hold on to this era as long as possible, coming at the expense of many. Power stancing, or dual-wielding two separate weapons of the same class, was introduced in Dark Souls 2, and was limited to it, until Elden Ring. Dark Souls 3 had specifically paired weapons, but with no customization available. This one should be pretty self-explanatory, even if the trees in Elden Ring are not likely actual trees, but similar concept nonetheless. This one might be about the biggest stretch in the video, admittedly, but the way Lansax ambushes you reminds me a bit of how the Pursuer does in the first potential encounter. If you could kill Lansax normally in this first encounter, I would be more convinced, but he's scripted to leave midway if you don't have enough DPS. Meaning you can kill it, but they don't really intend you to. The Twin Blade weapon class were dropped after Dark Souls 2, but they were brought back to Elden Ring. And thank God, I love Twin Blades a ton personally. The way the obstacle of both the Hero's Grave chariots and Executioner's chariots work is pretty similar. You essentially have to get across the area while avoiding them with nooks along the wall, along with dealing with a few adds. The main difference is that one is a proper boss, and the other one is more of an obstacle, though you can destroy it too, with some environmental shenanigans. The Land Squirts remind me a fair bit of the Poison Broomer, both being some sort of mollusk thing that primarily attack with their status effect, which can vary. They can both also be in jumbo size. The White Mask and the Mannequin Mask are both vaguely human faces that definitely are a little bit uncanny and freaky, so I wonder if it was a genuine inspiration. These two spells are identical, both setting yourself on fire to cause constant chip damage on nearby enemies, but draining your health at a constant rate too. These giant ants serve very different purposes, but it's hard not to feel like it was a reused concept in some way. This one might be a bit of a stretch too, but some of the anthropomorphic animal enemies in Elden Ring do remind me of the Lion Claw warriors, but it could just be that. These next two spells both have incarnations later on, but I believe they both started in this game. What mostly makes me think of this is the fur scarf thing around the neck. Visually, Far Missoula undeniably borrows a lot from the Dragon Aerie in Dark Souls 2. And this is jumping ahead a little bit, but since we're here, the way that you teleport to it after going unconscious also is a parallel to how you teleport to Archdragon Peak in Dark Souls 3. These ones are a similar concept, but in reverse. The Arumi is a whip that attacks as a sword, and the Puzzling Stone Sword is a sword that acts as a whip. At least mechanically, as the Arumi is sword-shaped as well, but the blade bends as a whip, of course. An extension to the Soul Greatsword, the Dark Greatsword and the Adula's Moonblade are giant magic sword wings that have a projectile fall behind to extend the range. 3 NPC enemies, some of which are recognizable enemy armor and the like, though the Gank Squad is certainly much tougher. If anything, they're both quite a nothing fight. poison dragons are used very sparingly in the series, so it's not hard to make the comparison between these two. This is 100% a reused concept. Though admittedly in my head, the Dark Souls 2 chains were a lot bigger. I was surprised when they were barely big enough to walk on when I got this footage. Both of these being an ice-themed rapier with a projectile attack sold me very fast. Though frost wasn't a status effect in Dark Souls 2. We'll discuss that soon. Albeit not nearly as bad, the consecrated snowfield's low visibility snow area reminds me of... oh no. Oh god, not this place. No! No! And finally, the long bridge and mountaintop of the Giants reminds me of the bridge before the Throne of Want. Not necessarily the only time this concept is used, but this might be the two longest bridges in this style. There's a ton of knightly armor sets in the Souls games, but aside from mixing from different sets, this Dark Souls 3 knight set looks the most like the one that Twin Husk sells. On top of Estus Flask being as it would be, Ashen Flask were also introduced in Dark Souls 3, and it worked the same as it would in Elden Ring, being able to decide the ratio of Crimson to Cerulean Flasks you wish to have. Oh boy, I'm sure glad they brought back the Thralls, my favorite enemy. Here's a handful of more enemies that were brought back nearly 1-to-1. This one surprisingly took longer than expected, because yeah, there's no wolf enemies in Dark Souls 1 or 2. And in 3, it wasn't until the first DLC. With this in mind, you may wonder why I didn't mention dogs in Dark Souls. We don't talk about dogs in these games. The Bloodhound Knights being semi-feral knights crawling in all fours and still wielding a sword reminds me a fair bit of the Erathone Knights, but there's still plenty of differences in their moveset. The Knights as a more remind me a fair bit of the Pontiff Knights, being icy warriors with curved swords, and both pretty tall to boot, but also a little bit of the Dancer, with some of the dancing style attacks. Frostbite was added in Dark Souls 3, and it works similarly as in Elden Ring, doing a percentage of damage when procced, but also reducing your defense until it's cleared. Although apparently in Dark Souls 3 it also affects stamina, which it doesn't in Elden Ring. Didn't remember that. While the visual effect on it and things like travel speed are different, they work almost identically, being conceptually a swarm of bugs traveling at the opponent, causing blood loss when in contact enough. The flat top design of the Santa's crown originated in Demon Souls, but the rest of the Dark Souls games except this one had more of a bulb figure to the crown, so it feels more directly called back to in this game, in the form of the Mushroom Head helmet, or the enemies that have it themselves. These two are identical, an area of effect spell that slowly hurts anyone who stands in it, including yourself. You know you want to burn both of them with fire. Anyone remember these monstrosities? Given there's only 4 in the game, and they are out of the way from progression of the game, I wouldn't be surprised if you did. And it's not hard to see that Miyazaki might have a weird thing with freaky hands. With this and the last entry, there sure is a lot of nightmare fuel in these games. Obviously stone gargoyle enemies isn't the most original idea, it's even been done in prior games, but the way they use both of these is quite similar, being rather tanky enemies that ambush you on occasion. The cut ragged armor from Elden Ring 1.0 looks a fair amount like the sunset armor, just minus the pouches and little details like that. The main thing that makes me compare these two is the little transparent veil they have in the back, but even outside of that, there's a few small similarities. Not only are both of these fire-based whips that have a fire effect when using their special attack, they're also both hair, so yeah, kind of feels like a direct inspiration. This one is quite obvious, even the wind-up animation is identical. You can't hold the soul stream until you run out of mana like Comet Azure though. It just stops after a second or so. A singular sword that can have 2 different elemental techniques feels quite unique to the series, and the laser one along with the Comet Azure feels pretty inspired. Dragonfire or Akio's Flame feels like an expansion on the Twinkling Dragonhead stone. They both spawn a dragon head just to shoot fire, and you can move alongside it. And likewise, the Dragon Claw is somewhat similar to the Torso Stone effect, though with one hand instead of two. The design of the Serpent Hunter looks somewhat like the Godslayer Sword Spear, just a bigger blade, I guess? And you know, the name sells it for me as well. And of course, the Serpent Hunter works like the Storm Ruler as well, though it's a Demon Souls throwback too. Jaren looks so much like Gale that people just outright call him Gale a lot of the time, since it's not an NPC who's very relevant. Not to mention you likely saw him first through the loading screens before learning his name. These spells work the same, the only difference is that Snap Freeze goes for a little bit of a line, meanwhile Mist grows from one spot. This one should be pretty obvious too. Both of these are enemies that are more so environmental hazards than traditional enemies, and the form of attack is not too dissimilar either. They both even have wings. These are also identical, but the explosion resulting from roiling magma is much bigger. Dark Souls 3 was the first to have a spell that forms a magical bow, so hard not to feel like it's inspired, but of course in a different element and animated differently. Fortissax being a dark dragon makes it inevitable to feel a comparison to Midir, but even more so than that, this laser from Placidusax is 100% a reference to the one Midir does, just in doubles instead of a singular beam. The general idea of an area being completely covered in ash, and even the way it is framed, is very similar in the Ashen Capital as it is in the finale of the Ring City. Could even make a comparison to the kiln in Dark Souls 1, but it feels more on the nose in the former. And to expand on the Discus of Light, the Triple Rings of Light could be a take on Gale's multi-disc attack. You may have noticed a lack of weapon art so far, and that's because we're going to cap off the video with all the ones I noticed, and elaborate on the ones I have comments on. The difference with this one is that in Dark Souls 3, the secondary attack is a parry instead of a downward slash, but the rest is the same. This one is extra interesting because in the 1.0 version of Elden Ring, this Ash of War is named Oath of Sunlight as well. For this one, the leap back at the end of the Wolf Leap reminds me of the first part of the Finesse. This one is a bit different in that the Lothric banner, you have to stay near the user to keep the buff, where the Commander Standard you can leave, but it only lasts 30 seconds. The vertical slice for Moonveil feels like a more refined and, well, useful version of the vertical slice of the Frayed Blade. To cap off the video, let's discuss something that's not a callback per se, but a cut concept. There's good evidence to believe that the Ulcerated Tree Spirit was an unused boss or enemy in Dark Souls 3, and in a way it does feel like one. Although I couldn't tell you why exactly. Perhaps it's because the theorized Pus of Man aspect of it, but if you want to hear more about that, or how this was found out, check out the Zully the Witch video on it. And that is all for the video. This is one that's been on the books for a long time because I haven't gotten around to doing it, just been working on other things instead, but I'm glad to finally have done it, especially because DLC is right around the corner. Whenever the DLC properly comes out after a little while, I'll probably make a video like this, just covering all the things that are similar. As always, if you agree or disagree with any of these, respectfully let me know in the comments below. Any of them that I think are viable, even if vaguely, I'll give a heart. And I'll try to remember that so I don't just heart everything as usual. And before I go, if you're subbed from the 1.0 video that I finished a little bit ago, well, thank you for coming back to another video that isn't even that. Due to the response to that video, I will be coming back to 1.0 very soon. So you will get fed if you want any more 1.0 content, because that will be the next video. And it'll be for the Demon Souls remake. So it might take a little while, just be warned. I'm hoping around a month or so. So look forward to that. But yeah, if you want to watch more videos like this, I do have one for the rest of the Soulsborne games, and Sekiro for that matter. And I guess even for the DLC trailer that we got not too long ago. But yeah, if you like this, consider subscribing. Thanks to my members for supporting my channel as always. I hope to see you again. Bye-bye.